Hello and welcome to our Introduction to Maps. The lecture was written and is of course given by myself, Chris Gall, and it corresponds in AP Human Geography to topic 1.1. Worth noting, by the way, that as we go, there's not a ton of text on the slides, so that if you want to just listen, you're really not necessarily going to be missing very much. So reference maps are maps that have some kind of a purpose. They want to show us some specific bit of information. In other words, they want to provide a reference source for us. So they might show political boundaries or cities like the map on the slide there does, or it could be something like factories or things like that. But the important thing is it's focused on a specific type of information. So they can be political maps like the one on the slide, but they don't have to be. A reference map would also be, for example, a subway map, or I live in Seattle, and if you catch the light link, the train maps, the stop maps on the trains. Okay, road maps are reference maps. Climatic maps are reference maps. Topographic maps, that is to say, maps that show elevations relative to sea level, or maps that show economic information, for example, the location of factories or the location of specific resources. Basically, if a map is going to show you the physical location of something, it's a reference map, because that's really the purpose of reference maps. Okay, thematic maps are our other major category of maps, and these are maps that tell some kind of a story. They explain how things are in comparison to something else, somewhere else. So, for example, if we look at the map on the slide here, it's an election map from 2016. When you look at it, it's easy to see that the Republicans, in red, had majorities across a lot of the land in the United States. Okay, but if you know a little bit more about, say, the location of major urban areas, then you could see that the Democrats, who were in the blue, took the vast majority of major urban areas. And if you're not sure, major urban areas are most typically located along coastlines or other waterways. So there are several different types of thematic maps. There are choropleth maps, like the ones above, where they use color and shades of color to show specific bits of information. Graduated symbol maps, where they'll use symbols, like pie graphs, for example, to show the percentages of something. Dot maps, where literal dots are placed onto the map to equal some value, and then you can use those dots to show the density of that value in a given area. Or cartograms, where they actually change the physical shape of the map, of places on the map, to show something about value. So, for example, if we were talking about a population map, India and China might appear super huge, and Canada would be relatively small, right? And the easiest way to tell the difference between a reference map and a thematic map is that a reference map literally just tells you where something is. A thematic map will tell you how one area compares to another in some type, with regards to some type of information. Okay, when we talk about spatial patterns on maps, it's worth remembering that all maps show some kind of information. Okay, I don't care what the map is about, it shows some kind of information. And geography as a science is all about interpreting that information and attempting to explain the patterns that you see. It's a very visual field of study in that sense, right? Because it's all about how are those patterns spread out across space. So for thematic maps, the patterns that you want to look for are related to how close things are together, which is to say how clustered they are, or how far apart they are, how dispersed. And while those seem like opposite sides of the same coin, and in some ways they are, they're also very different things. So for clustering, for example, matters if we're looking at information like the density of something. But dispersal matters a lot more if you want to see patterns of interactions, right? So on reference maps, what we're looking at when we're talking about spatial patterns, we want to look at things like absolute direction, as in a straight line between two places, right? What is the direction? Is it north, south, east, or west? The relative direction, which is to say, is it up and down on the map? Is it to the left or to the right? When we're talking about other things on the map. Absolute distance, which is a literal measure of how far on the map. And relative distance, which is how connected or economically related two locations are. As well as relative distance might be things like the elevation of something. Okay, so what we're talking about with relative distance is comparison. And when you think about spatial patterns on maps and you see that absolute, that's always going to be an unchanging value. Okay, that's never going to change. When we talk about relative things, just know that it's going to change depending on what's going on and who we're comparing it to. Okay, so I like this particular map just because I think it's kind of funny and it makes me chuckle. But all maps in general are limited in terms of what information they show, and those limitations are going to differ depending on what type of map is being discussed. At its most basic level, maps are limited in that they are not the same physical size as the area they're trying to show. So as a result, the map makers have to leave out information in order to make other information more prominent. Thus, a map of houses in a neighborhood, for example, might neglect to show the size of the yards for each house, or they may choose to use basic squares for each house without mentioning which houses are larger, which houses are smaller, or which have more than one story. Okay, maps result in distortion because at the end of the day they're two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional phenomenon. And if you've ever tried to draw, you know how incredibly difficult it is to get the proportions correct so that everything looks right in a picture. Okay, map makers suffer from those same kind of problems. Every map has distortions. These distortions, however, are of specific types and are easy to start to see once you know what you're looking for. Most common distortions on maps are distortions around shape, area, distance, and direction. Depending on the goal of the map maker may choose to minimize or maximize one of those things in order to maximize or minimize another. Thus, for example, on the Mercator map, which is one that's up in most classrooms in the country and certainly was up in every classroom in the country when I was a kid, the map maker chose to distort size when we get to the poles, right? Greenland, for example, nowhere close in size to Africa, right? But he did that so that he could keep direction absolute. Mercator maps are actually designed around navigation, so it's very easy to go from one place to another because you draw straight lines on the map. Okay, but again, what it does is it takes Antarctica, for example, and it stretches it all the way across the bottom of the map. That's just not true, right? Antarctica is not that big. Greenland's much smaller than Africa. Okay, so just some things to keep in mind as we're talking about and thinking about those limitations on the map and distortions and things. So essential knowledge for this lecture, and these are drawn straight from the College Board course description, so you might want to go ahead and do a quick check your notes, see if you have following types of information. The types of maps include reference maps and thematic maps. Okay. The types of spatial patterns represented on maps include absolute and relative distance and direction, clustering, dispersal, and elevation. Also, that all maps are selective in the information that they show. Map projections inevitably distort spatial relationships in shape, area, distance, and direction. Okay. So they're going to distort them in one or more, generally more, of those areas in varying degrees. So, hopefully you have enjoyed our lecture, and I will talk to you the next time I've got a lecture.